Now, across Africa, recent elections have followed a worrying pattern. Sidelined opposition voices, disputed results and protests driven largely by young voters demanding fairness. Now in Cameroon, 92-year-old Paul Biya secured an 8th term despite growing unrest. In the Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara won a 4th term after his main challenger was barred from the race, fueling tensions. And in Tanzania, hopes tied to President Samia Suluhu Hassan faded as the vote faced violence, and the exclusion of key opponents. Analysts warn these outcomes deepen public frustration and weaken fragile democracies, especially in a continent where young populations are increasingly demanding accountability, transparency, and real political competition.
And to talk more on this, we're joined in the studio by Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, who is the National Democratic Institute Africa Director. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with Cameroon. You are from Cameroon now. Paul Biya just won re-election at 92 years of age. Do you consider what currently exists in Cameroon as a democracy?
No, not really. And I think first, I should say it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really delighted to have this conversation. And the conversation is appropriate because when we look at what's happening across the continent, as you indicated in your lead story, there's reason to worry that the expectations of Africans, especially the younger generation of Africans, are not being met. And if you take Cameroon as an example, it's really difficult to explain that a 93-year-old individual will be seeking to serve another 7 years as president of a country where the median age is 19 years. And with all the controversy around that particular election, there's a sizable segment of Cameroonian population that believes till this day that Biya did not win the election. There are also figures being circulated to show that Issa Chiruma, who was the other candidate in the race, actually garnered more votes on election day than was declared by the Constitutional Council. And so I think the story on Cameroon's election hasn't ended quite yet. It's really difficult to see how Biya is going to get the legitimacy that he needs to be able to govern.
You know, the country is obviously at crossroads, and you are from there, so you understand what is going on, the nuances. What do you see happening after this? And why does it seem like the opposition is so weak that one man and his family have been running the country for over 40 years? What do you do? What do you do from here?
Well, it's difficult to explain to people who are not Cameroonians.
Yeah, so please try.
What has happened that one individual can be in power for 43 years. It's really, I mean, he has the track record as we speak of being the longest serving president in the world. That's most unfortunate. It's not a record anyone should have. I think you have to, in looking at the politics of Cameroon, you have to come to the conclusion that Biya has survived in power through the use of corruption, patronage networks, also through sheer brutality of instrumentalizing the justice system, instrumentalizing the security services to go after opposition, to the point where a lot of the opposition leaders are either in jail or out of the country.
Right.
And so in that kind of context, it's really difficult to consider it a democracy and to consider it open for diverse viewpoints to be heard.
Okay, now I think one of the lesser spoken about conflicts when it comes to Cameroon is the conflict of the Anglophone. Not a lot of people speak about this, and I don't think many people know about this. Can you give some commentary to that? Can you give some highlights about what it means? What is currently going on in Cameroon when it comes to this Anglophone conflict?
Well, first, I'm glad that you asked the question because the Norwegian Refugees Council did issue a report a year or two ago to say that was the most underreported, uncovered story in the world, which is most unfortunate because what you have in Cameroon is an Anglophone population, that's 20% of the population, that feels extremely marginalized, that has no opportunity to lead, to also contribute to the leadership of the country, and that had in the past expressed their grievances through the normal channels of citizen petitions to their government. But this was met by sheer brutality that then pushed some segments of that population to take up arms to defend themselves and their families and their communities. It's been 8 years in the running. The conflict has not been resolved. People are still dying, even as we speak. And Biya is no longer in the state, intellectually or even physically, to be able to handle the resolution of that conflict. And it's most unfortunate that now, on top of that conflict, Cameroon is also facing issues in the extreme northern part of the country with Boko Haram incursions into the Lake Chad Basin countries, including northern Cameroon. And on top of that, we now have a post-election conflict that Cameroon is going to have to resolve and grapple with.
Right. Now, having said that, what do you think the role of international actors would be?
Well, for a country like Cameroon, that depends on international partnerships. It's really incumbent on these international partners, development partners, to weigh in and to be able to have their voices heard when the country is still salvageable. We don't have to wait. The international community doesn't have to wait until there's full-blown catastrophe to be able to then come in and try to either issue statements or salvage what is left. There's still an opportunity for the international community to weigh in, and I think in the minds of most Cameroonians, whether you're talking about the Anglophone conflict or you're talking about the recent post-election contentious election, many Cameroonians are really disappointed that the international community is not speaking out, is not able to talk in favor of truth and transparency, and has allowed Biya to get away with murder.
Right.
So many African countries gained independence in the 50s and in the 60s. Some of them, or most of them, transitioned to self-rule and democracy. There was a point a lot of people went into military rule and then returned to civilian rule. And then now some are returning to military rule again. There is the general view that Western-style democracy has not really worked for Africa. What's your response to that?
You know, I'll give you a very honest response because I think that that conversation needs to happen. But in many ways, the conversation is not as thorough as I would expect. I think people are looking for shortcuts, solutions by putting out slogans which may be interesting to listen to, but which in the end do not really matter or cannot be sustained by solid arguments. First, I would say democracy is not a foreign concept to Africans. Before we became nation states in our communities, in rural areas, we had our governance systems. We had chiefs, but we also had the kingmakers. And so the chief did not have all the power to himself, because if at some point he wasn't following the tradition of the community, the kingmakers could rally around and call him to book.
But that was African democracy. What most of us are practicing now is a kind of Western style, democracy. That's the argument.
No, I think there's an important premise in that conversation, which is the emergence of African nation states. At independence, all of these communities, diverse communities with diverse traditions, with diverse customs, with diverse judicial systems, legal systems, came together to form nation states. Okay, the nation state is not an African concept. And the question for us as Africans is, how do we make these nation states function? How do we, in a country like Nigeria, with its diversity, get all Nigerians to feel that they belong and that they can contribute? And the only way that you do that is by creating a democratic system where all voices can be heard and where everyone has a seat at the table. That's why I feel that democracy is very, very adapted to our African context. And the people who say, it's not African, have no alternative to propose. So should we live under dictatorships? Should we live under military regimes? Is that what is good for Africans? And are we really saying to Africans that you Africans have a right to an inferior system of government, while the rest of the world can live in democratic societies where young people can see a future for themselves and enjoy the liberties that exist in other parts of the world? I would say no.
So since you mentioned military now, you see that a couple of African countries in the West have transited to military rule. So I think then what you're saying is that you do not agree with that military style of government, and one of the reasons is that people say that their needs are not being met in this democratic system. So how do you also react to that?
I understand the grievances that people have with their governance. And if you're working on African issues, you would see even in the data that is published by Afrobarometer and other think tanks, that the demand for democracy is very high, but the supply is very low. And so when people take to the streets, they're expressing those grievances. But in that expression, they're also asking for more democracy. They're asking for more rights. They're asking for accountability and transparency, and for their governments to be held responsible. But what is happening in some countries is that the military sees these grievances, and some military, not all, but some militaries see that as a pretext to get into power. And once they're in power, they use slogans and propaganda to make it look like everyone is being served. But at the end of the day, they're depriving those same citizens of the rights and freedoms that the citizens aspire to get. So I think it's a short-term solution, but that's not sustainable over the long haul.
So it's interesting that you mention other countries. Cameroon just had Paul Biya come back into power. Tanzania has also just had the elections. Gabon is also facing a really big tussle. What common patterns do you see in these ruling elites in maintaining their power? What do you see that keeps coming up over and over again in such nations as Cameroon, Tanzania, and Gabon?
Yeah, I think that for observers of African politics, there's a dominoes effect, there's a contagion effect in our politics. Going back to independence, when the colonies started advocating for independence, each colony stood up and wanted independence. When the first military coups happened in the 60s, a lot of military coups then followed. When countries started advocating for multipartyism and national conferences in the 90s, all of a sudden there was a very positive trend. And I would say that what we're seeing now, especially in the last decade, has been a very negative trend on our continent. The pendulum seems to be swinging in the wrong direction with these flawed elections, with this exclusion, with this violence. And my hope is that at some point, the African Union, our leaders themselves are going to come to the realization that we're going down the wrong path and that something positive needs to happen. And if it happens in one of these countries, we've seen some happy stories, like in Botswana that had good elections, like in Namibia that elected a woman president. We've seen some of those. We need to see more of those positive stories to then also tell their peers that you can govern justly and that Africans, especially the younger generation of Africans, are asking to be governed differently.
I like that you mentioned the younger generations, because from these countries that were mentioned and from around the world, I think we've been seeing a trend of these Gen Z protests. Yes. That's what people have been touting them as, these Gen Z protests that have been going on in numerous countries around the world. Sure. What do you say about these? What's your comments on this?
I think the Gen Z movement is a positive movement. It was about time that the younger generation come out and have their voices heard. That, for me, is a very positive development. We should also remember that Africa is a young continent. The median age across this continent is about 18 or 19 years.
Yes.
And so these young people need to feel that their future is being guaranteed by the leaders of today. And if they don't come out and speak for themselves, nobody is going to pay attention to them. We should also remember that in 20-25 short years, 1/3 of the world's population will be, in terms of youth, 1/3 of the world's youthful population will be African. And so this Gen Z is positioning itself to lead the world. And I think that it's an early warning sign to our leaders to say, listen to these young people, bring them into the conversations. And I am very impressed by the fact that every time there's a Gen Z movement, whether it's here in Nigeria when we had the NSAS, that was the precursor to the Gen Z movement, or in Kenya, or even in Madagascar, that they always come out on issues. It's against police brutality. It's against public spending. It's about transparency in public debts. It's about taxes. It's really on issues, which is a positive contribution to African politics. And I hope that the leaders would listen and find ways to engage with this young population.
You mentioned the African Union and the role that it could possibly play in all that's happening within the continent. Do you really believe and have confidence in the AU, an organization that is, you know, funded by foreigners and whose headquarters is even literally built by foreigners? Do you really think that the African Union has what it takes, you know, to handle all this crisis? For instance, look at the peace in DR Congo. That peace accord, latest peace accord, had to be signed in Qatar. You know, it was worked on by the United States president. You know, AU did have a role, but I'm saying, do you really have, you know, confidence in the African Union?
That's an excellent question. And for someone like me and people of my generation who saw the Organization of African Unity, that was the predecessor to the African Union, it came a point when Africans also said that the Organization of African Unity was not serving any purpose, that it was now a club of heads of states who were only there to protect themselves. And that's why the Organization of African Unity was disbanded, and the leaders came up with this concept of the African Union that would look out for the African people and not just the African leaders. And when you look at it, the African Union has got the architecture, the infrastructure to be able to perform. The peace and security architecture of the African Union is very solid on paper. The Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance is one of the most progressive documents you could have in the world. The problem with the African Union is implementation. And when you talk about Tanzania, for example, I was shocked that 24 hours after the elections ended, when there was talk of all the violence and people being killed, that the chairperson of the African Union sent a message of congratulations to the president of Tanzania, when people were still saying this is horrible and shouldn't happen. Fortunately for the African Union, the observer delegation that was led by the former president of Botswana, former President Masisi of Botswana, issued a tough statement. So we need more of such leaders to stand up and call our regional organizations to perform in a way that can raise the well-being of our fellow citizens and give them confidence that these organizations really speak for them.
Wow. That was a very interesting conversation there with Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. He's the Senior Associate for Africa at the National Democratic Institute, the NDI.